Hello everyone and welcome to Design and Quilt Monthly for April 2023. My name is Mark Garretts and I'm an RNK National Educator. And this month we're going to be going over something that I think is very important to Design and Quilt, and that is backdrops. And we use backdrops to take pictures and turn them into quilt blocks and quilts. So that's what we're going to be covering this month, at least part of it. So this is part one. So last month in our overview of Design and Quilt, we went over a lot of the features, and one of the things we focused on in good detail was the quilt block creation tool. So we have an easy block creator, which is right here, and we have a advanced block creation tool, which is right there. Now these are a lot of fun to use to create your own quilt blocks. And we showed you last month how you create them from scratch. So basically drawing whatever you want or using the built-in triangles or rectangles in the Easy Block Creator to create your own quilt block. And we kind of created a few out of thin air out of our head. And that's a great way to do quilt blocks, and it's a lot of fun to create your own unique quilt blocks that way. But oftentimes we want to just recreate a quilt block that we already have. So that could be one of the built-in quilt blocks, in which case there's no need to really recreate it since it's already done for you. But what if you have a quilt block in the real world that you want to recreate? That could be a picture of a quilt block that's out of a magazine, or a quilt design that you bought, or a quilt book, or even a real quilt that you took a picture of. So in order to do that most efficiently, rather than just having to look at the picture off to the side and try and figure out where all of the different lines ought to go, what we can do instead is we can import that picture into our workspace, and then we can trace or design over the top of it. And when we do that, we call that using the picture as a backdrop. So that's the RNK Design and Quilt terminology for bringing in a picture that we're going to use simply as a background image that we can create over the top of. And there's lots of uses for that. We're going to be going over all of them. This is part one, so we're just going to kind of do a quick introduction to what backdrops are and how to manipulate them. So to bring a backdrop in, there's a tool over here on the left toolbar, cleverly named the backdrop tool. And when you click it, it's going to open up a dialog box that you can then navigate to anywhere on your PC, or if you have a cloud storage system, you can navigate there to bring in a picture of a quilt block. And these are images, and you can see I've got some right here. These are all in the PNG format for no particular reason, but these are the types of images you can bring in. So you can bring in an image, you can bring in a vector, like an SVG file. So all different kinds of images you could bring in. So these are the formats that it supports. So we're going to go ahead and open up this one here. I'm going to open up this Morningstar quilt block and click open, and that brings it in here as an image. Now you'll notice, first of all, that my grid is on top of this quilt block, and that's useful so I can get it aligned to the grid. But that is not the way the program works by default. By default, the backdrop will be on top of the grid, so you won't be able to see the grid underneath. So I want to show you how to switch that around if you want, and that's done with our program preferences, or this gear icon here. If I click it, I will get a screen that opens up, and what I want to do is navigate to this View tab, and there's a checkbox right here that says Show Backdrop Below the Grid. So my backdrop, which is my picture, is below the grid, so that means that the grid is on top of it. If I uncheck that and click OK, then you can see my backdrop is now on top of the grid and I can't see it. And again, this is the way the program defaults, and for most of what we do, this is actually fine. Okay, so you can change that preference as you need to. What we're going to do now, though, is look at the different ways we can manipulate this backdrop. So we can size it, we can rotate it, we can change where it is on the screen. So lots of different ways to do that. To size it, we have the standard sizing black handles here, and you can click and drag those. You can hear my dog barking in the backyard. And you can click and drag them either in or out to resize the quilt, okay, or the backdrop. So if it doesn't come in at a convenient size, you can use those tools to resize it. The blue dots will let you rotate it, okay. So this is just like other controls within the program and other RNK programs, Floriani programs, how we do that. So that is the simple way to do it, but maybe not the most accurate or convenient way to do it. So I'm going to do an undo a couple times here to get back to where it was, because what I want to show you is over here in the properties box, if the backdrop is selected, you have width and height controls here. You have X and Y position. We'll get into that later. You can scale it, you can rotate it, and you can change the lightness or darkness of it. Okay, so let's look at this last one first. If I move this slider over to make it a little lighter and click apply, it just kind of fades it out a little bit. Depending on your picture, sometimes that makes it easier to see what you're doing on top of it. So I'm going to move it all the way back to darker and click apply again. This width and height control here is very convenient if your backdrop is exactly the edge of the quilt. Okay, so in this case, the backdrop has been cropped, the picture has been cropped to right at the edge of the quilt. So this happens to be an 8 by 8 inch block as it is. If I wanted to recreate it as a 6 by 6, I could simply come in here and change my width to 6, and you'll see that the height automatically changes to match. You can't skew it or like you can in other programs, but or other objects rather. The backdrop is always proportionally resized. So if I click apply, now we have a 6 by 6 inch quilt block. But you can see that it's no longer centered on 0 and 0. So that's what this X and Y is here. Because the center was -4, which, you know, 0 is the center this way and 0 is the center this way. So -4 is my left edge, and 4 in the positive is my top edge. All right, so if I wanted to recenter this to the screen, I would have to change this, okay? So the center is half of our width, so that would be 3. So if I change this to -3, and I change this to +3, and click apply, now it goes back into the center. So that's what those controls do. And scale just makes it bigger by a percentage, and rotate, I can type in degrees, or I can easily do 90 or 180. All right, so that's what the rotation does. I don't need to show you that. It's pretty straightforward. All right, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to load a different backdrop. Before I do that, though, I want to show you one other control over here on the left, and that is the show or hide the backdrop tool. So once I've got a backdrop loaded, I can click this tool to get rid of it. Temporarily, it's still there. If I click it again, it will come back. If I want to change my backdrop, load a different one, I can click my backdrop tool, and that actually selects the backdrop. So at this point, so I can re-edit it. So if you need to go back and change your backdrop, just click the backdrop tool and it will let you modify the backdrop that's there. So if you want to load a new backdrop, what you need to do is come over to your backdrop, hover over the top of it, right click, and click either delete backdrop or load backdrop, which will load a new one. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to load this version of that same backdrop, but this is one that hasn't been cropped right to the edge of the image of the actual quilt block, and I'm going to show you what that is here. So if I click open, you can see here around the edge there's this white area, and that's because that is part of the image. All right, and so when you scan something out of a book or take a picture of it or have a real quilt that you take a picture of, you're going to have stuff around the edge. And if you're good with photo editing apps, you can go in and crop it there to get rid of this edge. There's not a good way to do that in Design and Quilt. You have to do that externally, but there's a way that we can actually just ignore this edge and get this image in the center here sized correctly. All right, so you can see right now that my image is 7 1/4 by 7 1/4, but my actual quilt is different. Okay, my quilt block is a different size. It's probably 6, I don't know, we'll see, but we have a really useful tool to measure that, and that's this ruler tool right here. So if I click it and I come over here and I start right on my edge and I click and drag over, you'll see it makes a rectangle. And this rectangle is nice because it's like a little ruler. You can see little inch marks actually in it. And I can get it so the lines are perfectly straight. And you can see right there, it tells me my distance is 6 1/2 inches. So I really want this to be 8 inches. I can't do it. I'm going to reselect my backdrop here. You can't do that conveniently here unless you want to do a little bit of math to figure that out. But if this is perfect, X and Y, you can just use this to do it. But there's a much easier, more convenient, more accurate way to do it. And that is with the Define Scale tool that's built into the backdrop. So what you do is you come over your backdrop, you right click on it, and you'll see that there's a pop-up here that's got Define Scale and Define Horizon. All right, so let's look at Define Scale first. If I click Define Scale and I come over here to my left edge, and I want to get as accurate as I can here, so I'm on my left edge, then I'm going to click and drag across and get over to my right edge, and it doesn't have to be edge to edge. It can be anything that you know the dimension of. All right, and so I want to get nice and straight. There we go. And when I let off, it's going to tell me, look, it's 6 1/2 inches. All right, so I measured it accurately. But I can change the length here. So I really want it to be 8. And what I'm doing is making where I measured 8 inches, not this whole block, because it's going to be bigger. So if I put in 8 and click OK, okay, now you can see that this is 8 inches across. We want to double check that. We can get our ruler tool and we can come across and measure, and if I get right on the edge, you can see right there, if I get it straight, it's 8. All right, so that's a great little tool to use. Now I'm going to zoom out a little bit and reselect my backdrop. Okay, and I'm going to rotate it. All right, so I'm just going to grab this little dot here and click and drag it to rotate my quilt block. So sometimes when you take a picture and you bring it in, it'll look like this, and that's not really useful. We want it to be nice and straight. Okay, so that is where the Define Horizon tool comes in. Once again, if we, let me double click my magnifying glass to get this big. Okay, if I right click on my quilt, my backdrop again, and I do Define Horizon, what this wants me to do now is click and drag along any line that I know to be horizontal. So I've got lots of ways to do that. I could do that along the bottom here, along the top, along the middle. I want to go ahead and do it along the middle here. So I'm going to get right on this line. Actually, let me do it on the edge here because it's a little easier to line it up. So I'm going to get right there. I'm going to click and drag. And the longer you make that line, the more accurate this rotation is going to be. So I'm going to click and drag all the way over the edge. Make sure my line that I've dragged is lined up with the edge that I want to be horizontal. When I let off the mouse, bingo, it rotates back to perfectly horizontal. All right, so those are your basic backdrop manipulation tools. That's about all we have time to cover in this month's lesson. Next month, we'll take a look at, once you bring a backdrop in, how we use that to go ahead and start creating quilt blocks. So I want to thank you for watching and invite you to come back next month when we'll go on to part 2 of creating quilt blocks from pictures or backdrops.